أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وآله الطيبين الطاهرين اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. Respected brothers and sisters, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Previously, in examining evidence for taqlid in our hadith, we examined very briefly the hadith that is attributed to the 12th Imam, Al-Imam Al-Mahdi Ajjalallahu Ta'ala Faraja, in which the Imam alayhi salam says in this hadith, وَأَمَّا الْحَوَادِثُ الْوَاقِعَةِ فَارْجِعُوا فِيهَا إِلَىٰ رُوَاتِ حَدِيثِنَا. As for events that occur, or anything that occurs, that you need guidance in terms of legal matters, or even more than that, then refer to who? Who is the reference that the Imam appoints for us during the time of the ghaibah? Ruwati hadithina, the narrators of our hadiths. So there's an important question here. Who are these narrators of our hadith? Well, there could be several arguments here. One could say, let's take it literally, and whoever narrates a hadith, anyone who's looked at the hadith of the Ahlul Bayt and narrates them, they're a source of reference. Whether they're expert or not, whether they're scholars or not, doesn't matter. The hadith says, go to the narrators of our hadith. Now, let's say someone knows the hadith of Ahlul Bayt in terms of narration. They've narrated 20,000 hadiths. They've memorized, let's say, even 30,000 hadiths. Now, the hadith itself does not say those who memorized, it just says those who narrate our traditions. Now, do you think, rationally, the 12th Imam, at the time of ghaibah, there are challenging circumstances that arise every day, legal issues. He's referring us to narrators of hadith just because they're narrated? So if Zayd comes and he narrates 30 hadiths, I can refer to him in legal matters and seek his expertise and opinion? Or these narrators have to be experts who understand the hadith and can give it a proper application? What do you think the message is in this hadith?
What you said last.
See, we have a challenge here. During the ghaibah, there's no access to the Imam, direct access. So there will be events, occurrences, legal matters that we need guidance in. The Imam is saying, look, you no longer have access to the Imam where you go and just ask them. So I have a plan for you. I have a system in place. The system is go and refer to the ruwat of hadithina, those narrators of our hadith. Well, which narrator of hadith is actually prepared and qualified to solve these problems for you? Anybody who narrates the hadith, or it's more than that? What do you think?
Obviously more than that.
Why? On what basis do you say that?
Because somebody would have to understand the underlying language, science of the hadith itself before they could narrate it to somebody. Because if now, narrating a hadith is very simple, straightforward. I could narrate a hadith to you, but if you have a question about the specific words of the hadith itself, and if you're not in the position to say it, then you simply say, well, this is something that the Imam said, I don't know what to comment further on it, then you're actually harming the concept of narrator itself. So this person has to be an expert.
That's a valid point. The Imam alayhi salam is asking us to refer to experts on hadith, not just any narrator of hadith. Because a narrator who doesn't understand the hadiths, the applications of the hadiths, the multiple dimensions of the hadith, cannot help you in that situation, can even confuse you more. The Imam could have just said, people, just refer back to the book of Kafi. Because remember, the book of Kafi was compiled in what era? During the minor occultation of the Mahdi. And you had these books of hadith. If the Imam wants us just to refer to the text of the hadith, without having an expert analyze it for us, he could have just said, refer to these books, and khalas, it's over. You don't need to refer to narrators of hadith. Because if the Imam means by narrators just tape recorders, people who just memorize the hadith and they narrate it to you without having expertise in the meaning of the hadith, then it would be easier to refer us to the book itself. The book of Kafi at the time was present. The Imam could have said, just refer to Kafi, it's enough. The Imam says, no, go to the narrators of our hadith. It's a given that the narrators of the hadith must be experts on hadith. And that's what a marja is. Question, why didn't the Imam say scholars in this particular hadith? Why did he say narrators of hadith? If what is meant by narrators of hadith is scholars who understand the hadith, then say that. Fuqaha, experts of our hadith. Why did the Imam say narrators of our hadith? If that's not the apparent meaning he intended, and what he intended is experts, why not say experts to begin with? Why use a term like that? What's the point? What's the goal?
Maybe you can go second.
No, I don't do that.
Because there's other narratives of different, not school of thought, but different. Sorry,
See, there are other schools of thought who have narrators, but remember, the Imam says, ruwat hadithina. It's a given that it's our hadith. But my question is, why did the Imam use the word ruwat, narrators? Why didn't he say experts, scholars of our hadith, experts in our hadith?
Maybe they could change it, but if it's a narrator, it's exactly what the Imam said.
Yes, that's the idea. And can you elaborate on that?
So I'm going to go at it maybe a little at a philosophical level as well. The way I'm looking at it is, at the end of the day, scholars are narrators of the Imam's hadith.
That's a key point. True scholars are mere narrators. How so? How are they just narrators?
Because at the end of the day,
We know that they use principles and years of studies to issue fatwas. But how are they just narrators?
because these are principles and things set by the Ahlul Bayt.
By the Ahlul Bayt. By using a phrase like that, ruwat hadithana, narrators of our hadith, the Imam is implying that the true scholars that you've referred to are not scholars who come up with their own opinions. You're not following their opinions. They're just messengers looking at our hadith and giving you their expertise in understanding our hadith. Nothing more than that. But what other schools of thought did, or what devious Shi'as with those sects did, they started inserting their own opinions. That's what the Imam is warning us about. And that's why you would use a word like that. And that's exactly why we call prophets messengers. Why is the title of the Prophet, his most beloved title is Rasulullah? Why? Why do we call him Rasulullah? Didn't the Prophet have an intellect? Didn't he make his calculations? Wasn't he the most intelligent human being? But we still call him a messenger. Why? Exactly. Because the idea is that he never inserts anything from himself. Everything is revelation from Allah. Now that doesn't mean that he does not have experience. Oh, he has a lot of experience. But in the end, he's just operating under God's command. Nothing from his own. And that's what true scholars do. Nothing from their own. They take the principles of Ahlul Bayt and they apply them and they issue fatwas. That's why the Imam would use a phrase like that. Why did I highlight this? Because today, some people who have objections to Taqlid, they will tell you this hadith does not support Taqlid in any way. Why? Because this hadith is telling you that the narrators, those who just narrate, not marjas and scholars, any narrator of hadith, they are my proof, they are my hujjah, refer to them. So go to the book itself. Just go to the book of Kafi, go to the book of Tusi, go to the book of Saduq, and you just read the hadiths because they narrated those hadiths for you. You don't need a scholar. This is the objection. So that would be our answer. Yes.
One other objection that even amongst Shias, let alone other people altogether, would be as far as the marjas go, nobody really sees them. They are in some corner where you hardly find them. I think they are missing the point, the fact that these...
Who, the marjas are hard to find? Yeah.
I mean, one of the key points is the fact that as far as why they are not being seen as much as due to their humbleness, where they don't want to be in the spotlight, where anybody would look upon them in that fashion. And God forbid if that element of ego would pretty much wear on them. So I think a lot of people do not understand that fact. Could you elaborate on that? In terms
Historically, scholars have tried to bring a balance between being guides in their community, reference points, but at the same time making sure that they're not following their ego. Because when someone becomes important in society, people start following them. That risk of following your ego and becoming arrogant becomes greater for them. So you will find many scholars, highly qualified, they run away from attention. And naturally that sometimes makes them a little bit less accessible. But there is a reason why they do that. Because history shows us that with a spotlight, with the feeling of importance, you start becoming arrogant. And these scholars then will deviate if that happens. So many of them, out of humbleness, they may not be so accessible. But let me ask you this question. This is not to say that scholars do not have a responsibility. Oh, Allah has commanded them to share their knowledge, no doubt. But my dear brothers and sisters, Allah created us with the intellect. And we know that the Prophet brought teachings for us. We know the Imams of Ahlul Bayt brought teachings for us. We should be the ones going after the scholar, not waiting for the scholar to come and find us. You need the scholar. On the Day of Judgment, Allah will tell you, there were scholars. Why didn't you make the effort to go? By the way, you think at the time of the Imams, especially those later Imams, they were easily accessible? You know people had to travel thousands of miles just to meet the Imam and ask them a few questions? You know how difficult it was in that era of political persecution? The same argument could have made then. The Imams were not that accessible. Allah's teaching people, you care about your faith, you go and sacrifice. I'm not going to make the Imam readily available at your service whenever you want. No, you go after the Imam. Today there's an expectation that I sit comfortably here, you the marja, put me everything on a plate. That's not how God's system works. No prophet of God did that. Deen, religion, requires sacrifice. It's a trial from Allah. When something is valuable, you don't expect it to be delivered to you on a golden platter. You have to earn it, work for it. So even if sometimes some scholars may not be accessible, go and find them. Go and search for answers. Go and seek their guidance and knowledge. You go out of your way to get the truth. Don't expect others to come and prepare everything for you. Even though, as I said, scholars do also have a responsibility. This doesn't mean that a scholar, you go and you lock yourself up in some room and say, hey, let the people figure out. No, they do have a responsibility. But the responsibility of the people to go after the scholar is greater than the responsibility of the scholar going and trying to find people. Keep that in mind. And that's how it was at the time of the Imam, alayhi salam. Yes.
And just to elaborate even further on that, some people then raise the question that, well, if he's so hard to find, then how would he be aware of all the affairs in the world in terms of the challenges that societies are facing? But maybe they're forgetting the point that these scholars have representatives all around the world, where that specific marja is well aware of every single challenge that's happening all around the world in every community, whether it's one country versus another. And then on top of that, that's how you would know that our Imam is also directly involved in our affairs, because he has representatives all around the world. So
that's a very good and valid observation. Sometimes maybe we sit here in a different country and think, okay, the marja is in his house, he never even leaves his house. So what does he know about global matters for the marja to be a source of guidance for me? The marja might physically be in a home and probably not travel much, but remember, they're well connected. They have representatives in most parts of the world, constantly updating them on the conditions of those societies and communities. Constantly they get questions about various challenges people are experiencing. Remember, one of the things a marja does, which we don't think of that oftenly, if a marja has 24 hours, hours and hours and hours. I've seen the marja sits and answers these legal questions. Yes, he has an office that answer the easy questions or the questions that are clear. He's already given them the guidelines. They know his fatwa. But with modern issues, challenging issues, complex situations, the marja will sit hours and hours in answering people's questions. We forget that the marja does that. We think he's just sitting there on a chair doing nothing. So when you're exposed to thousands of questions each month, you get an idea of what people are going through, what their challenges are, what their problems are. And remember, most scholars in maraja, even though they might not always be accessible, but for the most part, thousands of people meet them each month. I've seen group after group of people, visitors, zuwar, they come, they sit with the marja, they ask questions, he hears from them, he asks them. I've seen this with multiple maraja, many scholars. So they're well connected with the people too. Yeah, does this mean they're infallible, they know everything on earth? No, of course not. In the end, they're human beings. They're doing their best to be sources of guidance. But don't have the impression that they are completely isolated and they have no clue what's going on. No, they keep up. They keep up with the news, with political matters, with the challenges that are facing their followers. They spend hours and hours just keeping up with all of that. Yeah, they may not come and show it and show off about it and go on the media and tell you what they're doing every day. They try to keep away from that spotlight and the media attention to keep their humbleness and just to keep away the attention of some of their enemies, of course. But in the end, they're very busy addressing all of these challenges. So this is one hadith that is in support of taqlid, which scholars have cited. Another hadith. This hadith is from Al-Imam As-Sadiq alayhi salam, in which he says, it's attributed to the Imam, "Man kana min al-fuqaha sa'inan li nafsih." If there's a faqih, a scholar, and this scholar has guarded himself. What does guarding yourself mean? You protect yourself, you don't sin. He's pious. Hafidhan lidinah, cares about his religion. He's not a person who pursues power and money. Mukhalifan ala hawa, he opposes his desire. He's not someone who follows his desires. Muti'an li amri mawlah, you really see him being obedient, following the laws of Sharia. Falil awami an yuqalliduh, and the Imam uses the word taqlid here. It's for the laymen who are not experts to follow him. Now there are multiple aspects of discussion around this hadith, which is beyond the scope of this course. I just would like to focus on one objection. The hadith is very clear in its content that these qualified scholars can be followed. One objection that people are raising today is that the hadith says, فَلِلْعَوَامِ أَن يُقَلِّدُوهُ, and it did not say عَلَى الْعَوَامِ أَن يُقَلِّدُوهُ. The L in Arabic, the preposition lam in Arabic, means for. It's for the people. They have the right to. It's for them to follow him. The word ala in Arabic means on. If the Imam had said ala, it would have meant it's upon the laymen to follow the scholars, meaning they have to. Because when something is on you, that means it's an obligation. But when something is for you, it means it's optional. So this hadith says it's optional to follow a scholar. The Imam is not saying you have to. Because if he wanted to say you have to, it's an obligation, he would have said, فَعَلَى الْعَوَامِ أَن يُقَلِّدُوهُ. But the Imam says, لِلْعَوَامِ. And there's a difference between these two types of phrasing. So then this is not proof that taqlid is wajib, it's optional. You want to do taqlid, do. You don't have to. How can we respond to this objection?
Okay, so that's what I'm saying. Wouldn't that create confusion amongst many, where a person who may have some knowledge about some aspect of this world would say, well, I'm an intelligent being, I don't really have to follow marja as far as the rulings are concerned. I can make my own rulings when I just read the Quran, for example, or just thinking about it logically and using my intellect. I can come up with rulings myself.
So, if you remember in the first class, when we presented the logical argument for taqlid, without even looking at the verses or the hadiths, we pretty much did address this misconception that some people have, or this objection that they have. If you're intelligent, fine. You could be, your IQ could be 200, no problem. But in order for you to follow the laws of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you have to be an expert on the Quran, an expert on hadith. How do you become an expert? The Quran has over 6,000 verses. Have you read all these verses and the context for their revelation and the tafsir and what Ahlul Bayt commented on them? And if you want to know what Ahlul Bayt have commented, you at least can start with the book of Kafi, which has 16,000 narrations. Have you read those 16,000 narrations? And if there's a discrepancy amongst those narrations, which there are sometimes, do you know how to resolve that discrepancy and reconcile it? If you've done all that, sure. You don't need to do taqlid of anyone. Follow yourself. You're an expert by that point. But just being intelligent, inshallah you have a PhD in physics, but you opening the Quran and reading a verse does not entitle you to say, I'm an expert, I can implement this fiqhi ruling, this legal matter. Should be an expert in the Holy Quran. Being an expert in the Holy Quran requires years of rigorous study. Not just picking up the book and reading one page of tafsir. No. You have to be well versed first of all in Arabic. Are you a master in the Arabic language or not? If you're not a master in the Arabic language, I tell you, you cannot know the depths of Quran. It's impossible. So are you or no? This person who says, I'm smart. The first question I'll ask him, are you a master in the Arabic language? And do you know classical Arabic language that was revealed, that existed at the time of the Prophet? Do you know Arabic literature? Do you know Arabic grammar? Do you know Arabic morphology? Do you know Arabic eloquence? Do you know all of these fields? Just that requires 10 years of study for you just to be an expert in that. Let alone history. Let alone hadith that comments on the Quran. Let alone all of that. Just the Arabic language needs 10 years of rigorous study for you just to understand the i'rab, the vowels, the verse endings, the structure of the sentences. The person can be very smart, but he's not an expert. That's like a very smart physicist, going into another field and inserting his opinion, right? And then we tell him, wait a minute, why are you inserting your opinion? You're a physicist. This is another field. This is engineering. This is medicine. This is political science. It's like, no, I'm smart. I'll write you a prescription, but you're not a doctor. No, but I'm smart. See, intelligence has nothing to do with that. You're intelligent and we respect you for your intelligence, but you're intelligent in your own field. You're an expert in your own field. Yes, you have the intelligence. You can potentially become an expert. Faddal, go and study. I would tell this person, you're intelligent. I respect that. Go the next 15 years, study. After 15 years, by all means, say, I don't need anyone. Follow your own experience. No problem.
So based on the logic that you just mentioned, Sayyidina, so this individual could be anybody. Could be an atheist doctor or just a doctor who just, or a scientist who just converted. He would say that I have been through years of rigorous exercises of logical reasoning. I may not like the way this scholar is portraying the ruling or the reasoning behind this ruling, because it just doesn't make sense due to my rigorous exercises of logical reasoning in my field and what I've been through all these years. So I will go ahead and study these texts myself, even if it takes me 30 years. For these 30 years, I will choose to ignore any rulings of the scholar. I'm going to go down and use my logical reasoning to read the text and understand it. So would that be considered acceptable, where you would remain ignorant for 30 years till you master the thing, then you would start following it?
Very, very, very valid question. But I'll give you an example that will answer the question. Let's say you're experiencing a medical condition. There's a doctor, there's a well-known, qualified surgeon. You're not sure if the surgeon, in giving that treatment, is being logical in his treatment. You don't know. Maybe he is, maybe he's not. In fact, you have reason to believe he's not being logical for whatever experience you have. You've studied old, ancient medicine. You have a different way of looking at the world. But now you have a medical problem that you're suffering from. So you say to yourself, look, I'm going to sit and study the next 20 years and become a medical expert myself so I can figure it out. Fine, you have the right to do that. But in the meantime, from now till 20 years, what are you going to do? Whose treatment are you going to take? By rational people, what do rational people tell you? The rational people will tell you, look, now that you're not an expert, you better take the treatment of the doctor. When you become the doctor, you can give your different opinion. But in the meantime, you can't say, wait a minute, the next 20 years, I'm not going to seek the treatment of that doctor. I'll try to you can't figure out, what are you going to do the next week, the next month? You're still not an expert. Until you become an expert, rational logic dictates you must follow an expert until you become an expert yourself. Simple as that. So this person who says, I want to study for 30 years and then, based on my logic and understanding, I want to go by these rulings, they have that right. But in the meantime, as long as they're not experts, they have to follow an expert. What do they do at the end of the day? These are legal matters. Prayers, salah, fasting, khums, zakat, sighting of the moon, whatever it is. Okay, this person, let's say, says, my marja is not logical with moon sighting. You know, they say that. It's their claim. Okay. So you need 20 years to study fiqh to understand how to deal with this case. Tomorrow's Eid. What are you going to do?
Postpone it 20 years.
I'll go with the majority.
See, if you can push a button and stop Eid for the next 20 years, fine. You're safe. But tomorrow or the next day, it's Eid. What do? Do you fast tomorrow or no? See?
But how do I know that Imam Zaman is agreeing with what you're saying?
Because this is rational logic. We mentioned before hadith, before Quran, the intellect dictates that if you want to know what the Prophet said, what the Imam said, what Imam Zaman said, you have to either be an expert because the field is so big and deep, or you refer to an expert. If I'm not an expert, you have to follow an expert. This is by logic. The same logic that tells you God exists, right? The same logic that tells you God is just. He sent prophets. There's a day of judgment. There are imams who protect the religion. That same logic tells you you must refer to the experts to know what the Prophet and the Imam said. So that's pure logic. And logic supersedes everything.
I mean, the one other thing that I think a lot of people discount or don't take into consideration, that as far as these scholars, when they go through the rigorous curriculum, a logical reasoning is actually a big part of that curriculum. It's not that they have left logical...
Absolutely. In fact, every marja studies logic, mantiq. They are logicians, by the way. They went through all those studies. So the premises, the fallacies, the conclusions, all of that, they've mastered it. So they are logicians. But in the end, they're just using logic to understand the statements of the imams and compare their words next to each other. Because the words of the imams are based on logic. But they're not using their opinions here for me to say, no, I have a different opinion or a different way of looking at logic. In the end, as we said, they're just messengers. They're just ruwat. They're just narrating, but they're experts who narrate. That's the idea here. So now in this hadith, when the Imam says, فَلِلْعَوَامِ أَن يُقَلِّدُوا, the layman can follow them. It's for them to follow them. But the Imam never said, عَلَى الْعَوَامِ, it's on them to follow them. So it's not wajib. How do you respond to this argument? We in this hadith, we're just discussing this hadith. If someone comes and tells you this hadith does not say it's wajib to do taqlid, you can if you want to. فَلِلْعَوَامِ أَن يُقَلِّدُوا, it's for them. They have the right. It doesn't say عَلَى الْعَوَامِ. It's upon the layman to follow them. How would you respond to a claim like that?
I think you just answered that a few minutes ago in terms of if you have been through the rigorous science of understanding.
No, but the question is, why did the Imam phrase it this way? It should have been clear. The Imam says you have to follow. Why does the Imam phrase it in a way where it says you can follow them? Why? Yes.
Is it kind of like when the Quran says that it's not haram if you do the sa'i between something?
That's the first answer. Some people at the time would think that it's probably negative or haram to follow others. Because remember, we talked about how the Quran condemns blind following. So some people might confuse that with this and say, you know, maybe it's haram. Who says I have the right to follow? The Imam says, no, you can follow. The Imam words it that way in order to avoid that impression that people had. Otherwise, it's still wajib. Or like the verse of the taqsir in the salah, where Allah says, if you travel, there's no harm in you shortening your prayer. Well, it's wajib. Why does the Quran say there's no harm? Because some people thought, well, I'm skipping 2 rak'ahs, that's haram, that's going to invalidate my prayer. The Quran says, no, there's no harm in that. That's the first answer. Yes.
So I accept that the Quran also uses this type of, logic.
Correct.
Could you elaborate why? Because in my mind, if Allah is saying it's wajib, then not only is it okay, it's more than okay, it's the law of God, tilka hududullah.
Right.
Why not just say that it's
So
wajib?
there are 2 factors here. Sometimes something is so apparent and logically accepted that it seems the Quran and Hadith is saying, look, it's a given that you have to. It's a given. There's no need to even reinforce it. It's a given. But because there are some people who have the misconception that it's haram, we'll relieve them. No, it's okay. It's okay. That is psychologically more effective. See, let me give you an example. Let's say someone thinks this cranberry juice is haram, right? They think it's haram. Now let's say in Sharia it's wajib. On the day of Eid you have to drink cranberry juice. Just imagine, for the sake of argument. Now some people think it's haram. Or let me give you a more realistic example. Eating on the day of Eid, like not fasting, right? You cannot fast. It's haram for you to fast on the day of Eid. You have to eat. Or don't make the intention. But let's say you have to eat or drink something. Now, someone, let's say, has that impression that this cranberry juice is haram. I cannot drink it. So you go to the legislator and you ask him about cranberry juice. The legislator will tell you, look, it's okay for you to drink this. Even though it's mandatory to drink it. But he tells you, look, it's okay for you to drink it. Why would he psychologically phrase it that way? As opposed to saying, look, you have to drink this.
Because us humans are not rebuttal, but we accept things differently than by force. Instead of telling them you have to, we...
Well, in other areas, the legislator does say it's wajib. I mean, it's clear that you have to. But when you think something is haram, and it's wajib, it's very common to phrase it this way. Why?
But say, like, for example, when the verse of war comes, Allah says you might dislike it, but it might be better for you. And you might hate something and it's better for you, and you might like something and it's worse for you. So over there, it's also wajib.
You mean going to war?
Yeah.
Yes. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when it comes, that's a good example. Going to war when the Prophet is there is wajib. You have to go and defend. Now Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, how does He phrase it? Yes, you might hate it, but it's good for you. See, it's a convincing way to remove a misconception in your mind. Because in your mind, this is harmful, this is bad. I'm going to get hurt, injured, or even killed. So instead of Allah just saying, hey, it's wajib, it kind of comes off to some people as if the legislator doesn't care about them. No, it's wajib. Don't argue with me. Go and get killed and get injured. A more compassionate way to speak to the people is to tell them, look, we know you hate it, but it's good for you. It's a compassionate way to speak to people. And they're not just objects. No, they're your subjects. Allah cares about you. That wording psychologically gives comfort to the people, and it makes them feel that Allah is appreciating their efforts. Allah is not talking to them in a robotic way. Hey, go, that's it, end of discussion. No, Allah is compassionate with you. That's one idea over there. Now, that was the first answer about this hadith. The second answer, do you have to do taqlid, or you have other options?
You have other options.
What are the other options? Exactly, become an expert yourself. So the Imam doesn't say, you layman, you have to do taqlid. Yes, most of you have to if you're not. There are other options. One is go and become an expert yourself, and you don't need taqlid. Number 2, ihtiyat. If there is an issue, I don't know if this is halal or haram. I've got three paths here. One is to do taqlid, just follow an expert, he tells you halal, halal, he tells you haram, haram. The second path, you go and become an expert and figure out if this is halal or haram. The third path is what? No, that's the second path. Go and find out yourself. What's the third path? Stay away from it. Exactly. You're like, look, I don't want to follow the marja on this issue. I'm not an expert. I'll just be cautious. It could be halal, it could be haram. I will avoid it. That way I know for sure I did not make a violation. In some areas, you can do ihtiyat.
But if you essentially cross option A and option B, and if you're doing ihtiyat with everything, then wouldn't you essentially become a depressed individual by staying away from everything?
Yes. That the hadith has warned people of a consequence like that, right? But the idea of this hadith is there are some cases you'd like to do ihtiyat, no problem. Yes, for you to do ihtiyat in every ruling, that's impractical. And you will be burdening yourself. Allah does not want you to be burdened to that level, to that degree. But you don't have to follow a scholar in every single ruling. Either be an expert or do ihtiyat in some cases. That's fine. That's acceptable.
But as far as what you mentioned, ihtiyat goes, Sayyidina, 5 people can define ihtiyat differently. So how can you...
See, there are some complex situations where even the maraja would disagree on the method of ihtiyat. Like let's say I don't know the qibla here. You're stuck in a place, it's dark, you have no compass, you have no way of knowing the qibla. Do you pray in 4 directions? Do you pray in 3 directions, like some scholars say? That's not an area where I insert my opinion. It's just the clear examples. I'll give you an example. Tomorrow is Eid or not? Let's say the person says, look, this is such a confusing matter. I don't want to follow any marja in this issue. But I'm not an expert either. What's the third path? How do you do ihtiyat? It's very simple.
Fast and then go.
No, you can't fast. Fasting on Eid is haram if it's potentially Eid.
If you don't see the
Travel.
fast.
No.
Travel.
See, if one marja is saying tomorrow is Eid, the other marja is saying it's not Eid, based on their fatwa, right? So the person says, look, I've got these maraja, I think they're equally knowledgeable, I'm just confused, I don't know which one to follow, I don't want to follow anyone. I'm not an expert.
Take a travel.
Travel. At Fajr, be traveling. At Fajr. That way you don't make the niyyah of Eid, because you're traveling and a traveler cannot fast. So at 6 a.m., be in Ann Arbor, be in Toledo. So when the Fajr sets in, you're not making the niyyah. That's one way to do ihtiyat.
But as
Now that's burdensome.
no,
But if someone wants to do it, that's fine. They can. They don't have to follow a marja in that particular issue. That's the point.
But as far as this concept of traveling itself is concerned as well.
Now, yes, if the type of traveling is something scholars have disagreed, the distance, of course, that's not an area where I insert my opinion. But something that's agreed upon by everyone. Going to Columbus, Ohio, no discussion. Toledo, going to Toledo, and you're not a frequent traveler. A traveling that is clearly traveling according to all standards. See, this is a minor area where you could do ihtiyat. So that could be one reason why the Imam says they can do taqlid. Someone can opt for another more difficult option, fine.
But
If they want to bring that upon themselves, that's up to them. It's not the ideal thing to do, but it's a way out.
well, this individual say if they decide to go into Islam and learn more, and that's the first hadith they run into. They're like, well, there you go. I have a solid hadith that says I don't have to do taqlid, so I'm not going to go with option A.
Yeah, but I will tell this person, you're reading this hadith, are you a hadith expert? This hadith has meanings. We have to understand the linguistic meaning of the al, of the lam, the context, all these discussions we just had. See? A lay person cannot just pick up a hadith and use it as a basis for something, unless he's an expert. Or he's following an expert opinion. So that's what I would tell him. I'm like, on what basis are you just grabbing a hadith like that without being an expert? This is a science, see? It's the science of hadith. You can't just pick up a medical expression in some book and say, oh, I'll go by this expression. Well, you need an expert to tell you what this expression is about. So that's not valid for a person to do that. They need to ask an expert, okay, what does this hadith mean? How can it be applied? What are these other 2 options? This requires an understanding of the world of hadith and putting the hadiths next to each other. Okay, the person says, I'll go by this hadith. What if I tell this person this hadith is contradicted by another hadith? Have you examined the hadith that disqualifies this hadith? Or who said the sanad, the chain of this hadith is valid? Have you done this? See, you need an expert.
Well, this person.
That's the idea here.
Well, this person could have gone to the scholar A, who is well respected in the community, and asked that individual, is this hadith valid? And that scholar says, yes, it is absolutely valid. Bam.
It's valid, okay, meaning the chain of narration is valid, maybe the scholar's saying, but what about the depth of the hadith? What is the meaning of the hadith, the content of it? Okay, it's a valid hadith, what does it mean? I would tell this person, to know what the hadith means, you need to consult an expert. So, you get the idea. So my dear brothers and sisters, we've mentioned a number of hadiths that basically validate the actual system of taqlid. One very important discussion here. Is there a difference between Akbaris and Usulis? A lot of people think the Akbaris do not believe in taqlid and they condemn it. And this taqlid is a new Usuli thing. Something that emerged recently in the last 2-3 centuries. And before that, there was no concept of taqlid. Briefly, let's go through this idea here. Always, my dear brothers and sisters, when you're confronted with discussions like that, analyze them rationally and logically. Let's say someone makes the claim that no form of taqlid existed for hundreds of years with the Akhbari scholars. Question. Yes, brother.
What's an Akhbari?
So, that's a good question. What's the difference between Akhbaris and Usulis? They're Shia scholars. The main difference between Akhbaris and Usulis is how, the method that you use to extract fatwas and laws. That's the main difference. For instance, Usulis accept ijma' and consensus, whereas Akhbaris, generally speaking, sometimes would not accept ijma' and consensus. If your only proof for a fiqhi ruling is consensus, maybe an Akhbari scholar would not accept that. Secondly, we find that Usuli scholars give more prominence to the science of rijal, biography, where they examine the sanad and the chain of narration. Whereas Akhbaris basically would tell you everything in Kafi is correct. I don't need to go and investigate who the narrators are. All these hadiths are sahih. The Usuli says, no, I need to investigate each chain, I have to look at it. And that's another difference between them. Another difference between Akhbaris and Usulis is when it comes to ash-shubha tahrimiyya. If we have a doubt about something being haram, let's say tobacco, smoking. If it's not excessively posing harm to you, someone occasionally wants to smoke, let's say, is smoking haram in Sharia or no? The scholar looks at Quran and Hadith, there's no Hadith about that, right? Because smoking, let's say, did not exist at the time. The Akhbari says, whenever I have a doubt about something being haram, my belief is I have to exercise caution. I have to consider it haram unless I have proof that it's halal. The Usuli says the opposite. The Usuli comes from a school of thought. He says, if I have doubt that something is halal or haram, I don't find any evidence for it being haram, then I assume by default it's what? It's halal. So these are the differences between the Usulis and the Akhbaris. There are other differences, but basically they're scholars, they're expert in their field. Just the way, the methods by which they extract Islamic laws is a little bit different. So it's attributed to the Akhbaris that they banned taqlid and taqlid did not exist. I have a rational question. Let's go back to those centuries, 1,000 years ago. How did the people in villages and communities and cities, how did they practice their fiqh? Are you telling me that the average Joe, well, in that part of the world, the average Ali and Zayd and Mohammad picks up the book of Kafi that had 16,000 narrations and says, okay, let me read this chapter. I got my Hajj figured out, my Salah figured out, my interest, my business transactions, my khums, I've got it all figured out. Is that how it was? Impossible. Today, I as a seminary student, I pick up the book of Kafi, I'm confused in some parts. With 10, 20 years of experience, I still need to refer to experts. You think a layman is going to pick up the book of Kafi and figure out everything? Impossible. How? Especially women. In that society, they didn't have access to education. A lot of them did not even read and write. We know rationally the spirit of taqlid definitely must have existed. Those laymen would just go ask their local scholars. They had no other way. Tell me, what was the other way? You want it to be a decent Shia who practices your religion, practicing Quran and the Sunnah. Tell me how. How would you do that during the Akhbari era? Let's say we abolish this whole system of taqlid. Do not follow any scholar. So what do? Tell me. Quran, you're not an expert on Quran. Most people today, with all the information age that we have, believe me, they don't know anything about Quran. Just tell them simple things about Quran. Just words. Just the names of the surahs. They don't know what they mean. Ask them. Ask in the community today. Ask people, what does Surah Al-Zukhruf mean? Just tell me the name of Zukhruf. I don't want you to go deep into just tell me what Zukhruf means. 99% of the people in the community would not be able to answer you. Tell me what Ahqaf means. Tell me what this verse means. Tell me what Jathiyah, what's Jathiyah? You think people were using their intellect and knowledge to come up with rulings when they don't know the basics of Quran? Let alone hadith, the thousands of... So we know it was impossible for someone to be practicing and just referring to the books. In an era, especially when books were not accessible. You had to be rich to own a book of Kafi back then. Paper was expensive, everything was expensive. So tell me, during the Akhbari era, what did people do? How do you become practicing? Give me the alternative. What would people do? Rationally speaking. If you're not following scholars, if you're not following a scholar, then what were you doing? How would you figure out your religion for us?
Just not follow.
Wait for what? Wait for ilham. Wait for divine inspiration. So you get the idea, my dear brothers and sisters? Those who say there was absolutely no form of taqlid, that's a big fallacy. So what was different then about taqlid? There is a difference, we won't deny that. There is a big difference. The main difference that happened in taqlid is that in the last 3 centuries, we find, for instance, from the 8th century of the Hijrah, during the era of Al-Shahid Al-Awwal, who was one of the great Shia scholars in Lebanon, from Jabal Amir, and also in the 10th century, with Al-Muhaqqiq Al-Karaki. This is during the Safavid dynasty in Persia, in Iran. Basically, scholars gained a more central position in society, and even the title Shaykh al-Islam was given to marja like Al-Muhaqqiq Al-Karaki. And so we find the taqlid, the concept of taqlid, even though it existed since the days of the Imams, peace be upon them, we find it becoming more centralized. In the past, because Shias never had a state, never had a strong society, always persecuted, they were scattered in villages and some communities, so they would just refer to a local scholar who was an expert. That was their form of taqlid. But when you had the Safavi empire or dynasty in Iran and Persia, now you had a state ruled by Shias. Yeah, they were not scholars, they were kings and royals, but they were Shia. And a lot of them did have respect for the scholars. So when that happened, you found some prominent scholars who were known for their knowledge, they became in a position where other villages and other cities came to know about them and to follow them. So taqlid became centralized. And now people, even though they lived in different villages, they would ask, well, who's the main scholar in Isfahan, in Qazwini, in Tehran, in Mashhad, in Najaf? Who are those main scholars? Because now Shias had a community and state. So they started becoming more and more connected with each other compared to the past. Taqlid became more systematized and more centralized. And yes, and with that, scholars gained more power. Obviously, you gain more influence. If you've got 100 people, local village men following you, or you've got 10,000 people around the country following you, obviously your area and sphere of influence is going to be greater. So the concept of taqlid at its core is the same. Akhbari, usuli, they accept the basics of taqlid. Yes, following a marja who has that central influence, that's something that came later on. By the way, I'll be honest with you, the Akbaris did try to fight that. They believed it's not healthy to have a religious figure of authority having so much influence and power, because the risks then are greater. If that person turns out to be corrupt, then they could damage the entire society. So they just weren't comfortable when that transition was happening. And that's why they kind of condemned the system, because of these concerns, which are valid concerns. I mean, imagine if someone sits in that position of power and they are, let's say, corrupt people, right? Imagine the damage that they could do. And that's exactly what happened with Sunni schools of thought. These corrupt, deviant leaders of schools of thought came, and people trusted them, and they started a history of deviation because they were not qualified. So the Akhbaris had these reservations. We know we don't want the scholars to have too much power and influence, because then there's a risk that somebody can abuse that power, somebody can take advantage of that. Otherwise, the idea of taqlid was the same. And then we get to the discussion of wilayat al-faqih. How much authority does the scholar have? So historically, the Akhbaris and most usulis have said the only power or authority that a scholar has is in issuing fatwas. What's halal and what's haram, explain that for us. Number two, they are guardians of those who don't have guardianship. Let's say someone dies, his family members die, is a child, has no guardian. No father, no grandfather, no uncle. The marja is their guardian. He will look out for their well-being. If there's a mosque, which is a waqf, religious endowment, usually there is someone who has the guardianship over it, right? Let's say there's a mosque, a charitable institution, any type of waqf, endowment, religious endowment, that has no guardianship. By default, we have hadiths that state the scholar becomes the guardian. So historically, most scholars understood from the text that this is the area of influence of a scholar. Recently, scholars started re-examining the text, and they had different interpretations. So some of them said, no, the wilaya, the authority of the jurist, of the scholar, is much more than that. They can be heads of state, they could issue political orders, and so on and so forth. I don't want to get into this discussion, because that in itself is a very detailed discussion. But we find in the last 3 centuries, because now Shias had governments and communities, naturally scholars started to have more and more influence at a greater and more global scale. This doesn't mean that these scholars now invented taqlid. No, the taqlid was always there, but it became more institutionalized, I would say.
So could I use this as a reason to say, well, see, there has been some form of corruption that has made its way into this?
So where's the corruption then? See, when something becomes institutionalized, the risks can be greater for corruption, but the benefits are much greater. Why does every government, even democratically elected governments, why do they institutionalize ministries and services for the people? Why? Why do you have the Department of Justice? Why do you have human, human resources, Department of Education? Why institutionalize all of that? Let people figure it out. See, because you want to help the people, connect the people, protect their rights. So when taqlid and marja'iyya started to become more institutionalized, people had more access to them. With better resources, they could fund more projects, give more strength to the seminaries. Because historically, Shias were persecuted. They did not have the resources. Now that you have the resources, you can serve the people, you can serve the religion. It's not necessarily bad. Yes, the potential to take advantage of it can also be greater. Just like a government who has all these institutions, if they want to go rogue against the people, they have got more power. But does that disqualify these institutions? Not necessarily. So this doesn't mean that these scholars invented something new. With better resources, with more political backing, you can offer more services. And that's why you find some aspects being institutionalized. So it's not too fair to say that Akbaris were anti-Taqlid and then Usulis invented it. No, Taqlid always existed, but during the Usuli era, the last 3 centuries, yes, it did become more institutionalized. That's a reality. But is that a bad thing? No, not necessarily. In fact, if you look at one of the areas of strength for the Shia is the fact that they had these institutions. Without them, their enemies could have easily obliterated them and decimated them. But these institutions really protected so many communities. So it's not necessarily a bad thing. In fact, it's a good thing. Yes, people just have to be careful whom they're following, someone who's trustworthy. So that's the main idea in examining, Taqlid and the difference between the Akhbaris and the Usulis here. Any questions about this point? Yes.
Is there still Akbaris and Usulis today?
We still have Akhbaris today, by the way. They're not the majority. Most scholars today are Usuli, but there are Akhbaris who still look at texts a little bit differently, who might have a different vision of how people should do Taqlid, right? Or they're a little bit critical of institutionalizing all of that. Yes, we do have Akhbaris, even in the seminaries. By the way, there's one important point to mention here. One challenge that we're facing in recent eras with Shias and following their marja is that in the last few decades, in fact we could say in the last century, maybe in the last 100 years or so, Taqlid in the eyes of some people and some communities, and there are political factors behind it, social factors, people have started to develop an identity around their marja, such that them following their marja becomes part of their identity. They feel passionate about it. They start fighting with other groups. This is not sanctioned by the Imams of Ahlul Bayt. The Imams of Ahlul Bayt encouraged us to refer to the scholars. But remember, at the end of the day, you're just following the expert opinion of a scholar. Don't, give this infallible image to the scholar and develop an identity around the scholar or this marja, such that if anybody has a different opinion, you take it upon yourself and you make it a mission to attack them, to accuse them of deviation and corruption, and all of you are wrong except my marja is right. That's wrong. That's not something the Imams of Ahlul Bayt have sanctioned. We do see this in our era, and it creates tension. And a lot of times this tension is created by the followers of the marja, not the marja himself. The followers start feeling passionate, and then they get into trouble. The hadith says respect the scholars. They're God's greatest gift for a community. But just be careful. Don't idolize the marja. In the end, the marja is a servant of God, just serving you and giving you the fatwas, the expert opinions. Don't idolize them. They're not infallible. Don't ever put them at the rank of the ma'soom. Don't ever put them at the rank of an infallible. Now, when it comes to political views of the marja, even though they're guides, remember, most scholars historically said, when we look at the hadiths about taqlid, follow them when it comes to religious matters, especially legal issues. If your marja has a political, social understanding, they have a certain political perspective, is it binding on me as their follower to follow that political perspective? Is it binding on me? No, it's not. The vast majority of maraja are very clear on that. They're like, yes, if you trust your marja as a political expert in a political field, fine. You'd like to follow them, but you don't have to. Do you have to follow the social views of your marja? No, you don't have to. You follow your marja in deen. What's halal, what's haram, legal details. Yes, get guidance from them because they also have experience. But I think what's happening today is people in all of these areas, they feel very passionate about their marja's views, and then we start seeing problems in society. So no, nowhere did the Ahlul Bayt say, go and follow the Shia scholars in every single field. in science and politics and social issues and psychological issues. No, follow the experts. The marja is a psychological expert, follow him in a psychological opinion. If he's an expert in social matters, fine, follow him. But if he's not, and not every marja is. A lot of marja will tell you, look, this is my area of expertise. I'm not a psychologist. Don't expect me to act like a psychologist and give you words that psychologists give you. I'm not a political scientist. Yes, I do know where religion and politics intersect, but I'm not a political scientist. He may be, some of them are. You'd be surprised how well achieved some of them are, and really having experience in multiple fields. But in the end, keep that in mind. You're following them in legal matters. Yes, there is one branch of wilayat al-faqih that gives full authority to the jurist, that is a proponent of following the wali al-faqih or the marja in every single field. In fact, if the marja tells you, bring me a cup of water or bring me that bottle, it's wajib on you. It's like the imam of your time telling you, bring me that bottle. Mainstream Shia scholars in the seminaries historically have not accepted that much authority. But there are some proponents of that in the seminaries, but they're the minority. Historically, scholars have rejected that much authority. The marja tells you jump off the cliff. Do you have to follow that order? No. Some believe in that, yes. Some proponents of a special branch of wilayat al-faqih might say yes. The imam, the scholar sits in the position of the imam. If the imam were to tell you, you had to accept that command. He's representing the imam in every field. But most scholars have not accepted that. They've rejected this full-fledged authority of a faqih. Yes?
As far as what you mentioned, Sayyidina, even within the last 2 centuries, last 200 years, things have been developing, even in our field, as far as the usulis go. And do you see, as far as the new challenges that are being faced, which were some of the examples that you just mentioned, even elements of those challenges are slowly, gradually going away, where there is more consensus, and as time passes by, some of these gaps and differences...
There's more consensus on what?
On different issues, where maybe not all mirajas could be on the same page. Different controversial issues from that standpoint, even if it would be wilayat al-faqih speaking. But as far as the political views or social views over time, as time passes by over the next few decades, do you see it would be getting more streamlined, or some of those gaps would be going away? It's just one of those things that we are in that era right now. We're noticing these challenges. But I would say that within the last 30 years, for example, there are some gaps that have been going away, and things have been, more unity has been getting built as a result of it. It's just a matter of time that some of these things would, controversial issues would go away. Would you, any comments on that?
It's a given that in any time and era, you will have differences of opinion and some controversial issues, even at the seminary level. That's a given, because you've got many, many experts looking at multiple fields. So it's natural. But what sometimes ends up happening in the seminaries and in those, scholarly circles, is that you will find one scholar or one marja who's a proponent of a certain perspective or an idea. They come with such amazing knowledge and convincing evidence, such that after them, within some years, you find the mainstream experts find their views so acceptable, so logical, so sound, so strong, that you find some of those gaps being filled, and that maybe there seems to be consensus on that controversial issue. But it requires a pillar like that in the seminaries to really give momentum to an idea. This has happened, by the way, in our even fiqh history. For 700 years, scholars' understanding of hadith was that if a well becomes najis, like a drop of blood falls in it, all of it becomes najis. Even if the color doesn't change, the taste doesn't change, the smell doesn't change, because of their understanding of some hadiths. Then Al-Hilli came 7 centuries ago, so 7 centuries after that. 700 years ago, Hilli came, and he was a pillar in knowledge. The man was an expert. He authored over 1,000 books. Just imagine the size of this guy's knowledge. So he re-examined the texts, and he was able to prove in the seminary that all these hadiths that tell you need to remove water from the well for it to become pure, it's mustahab. Because now there is some contamination and people would drink that water. So by removing water from the well, new water comes in to fill in the well, and that becomes more healthy. Otherwise, the hadiths that state a qur of water, a large body of water, cannot become najis unless it changes in color, of course. Those hadiths are clear that the well does not become najis. So don't treat it as najis. He was able to demonstrate that so powerfully, such that after him, every scholar basically followed suit. This is just an example of a fiqh gap being filled. Sometimes socially, politically, you might have some gaps, and then a pillar of knowledge comes amongst the scholars, and they just change the perspective of even the seminaries. Because they bring a perspective that maybe others had not seen so clearly. That sometimes does happen. Not with every case, but with some cases it does.
But the one challenge that you mentioned, Sayyidina, that we are facing today is as far as the followers of these marajas, where they feel a sense of identity that they have built around the scholars. I mean, like you said, the imams do not sanction that, but I think that's open and obvious if you follow any of these narrations and copy, for example, where it warns you many times of these different aspects that you should stay away from, such as having respect for all scholars. But could it be due to the lack of knowledge of these followers, where they are essentially, since they've built that identity, they feel strongly about issues without...
I believe it's multiple factors that make people idolize their marja to an unhealthy level. It's multiple factors. One of it is ignorance. They don't even know why they're following or what taqlid even is. They have not looked at what we've discussed in these courses. Sometimes it's ego. When you follow a marja, and then your ego kicks in and you feel a sense of ownership. Well, my marja said so. You want to prove somebody else wrong, or start forming a group around your marja's identity. It becomes a sense of ownership that you have, right? An attachment. You develop an attachment and you're just fighting for that attachment. We have to be very careful to draw a line between respecting the scholar and accepting their guidance, but not to be too attached such that we start feeding our ego. I'll give you a very simple example. Let's say you follow a marja. Okay? Let's not bring any names. Let's say you follow a marja. Mohammad is a marja, you follow him. Why do you follow him? Because it's proven to you that he's the most knowledgeable. Inshallah, in our next class, briefly we'll examine why we need to follow the most knowledgeable scholar, and then we end the discussion on taqlid, and we will examine other discussions in this course. So let's say it's been proven to you that Muhammad the marja is the most knowledgeable, so you start following them. If 2 years later, it was proven to you that another marja is now more knowledgeable, and so you want to switch, do you have difficulty in switching or no? If you find yourself having difficulty in switching, no, you're attached to this marja, you feel passionate, you've idolized this marja, that's a warning sign. Because sometimes you will cause fitna in society because of this attachment. And you'll put down other fellow Shias. But if you say, look, I followed this marja because he was an expert, and he was a source of guidance. Now, this person is my expert. It's like switching your doctor. When there's a reason to switch, of course. You can't just pick and choose. We'll talk about that next week. Right? You should not feel any difficulty. I followed Muhammad because he was, I believed, based on the evidence available, that he was the most knowledgeable. Now I have evidence that this person is most knowledgeable. Follow him overnight. Because remember, you're not following Muhammad or Zayd or Ali or whoever. You're following Imam Muhammad Al-Baqer alayhi salam. You're following Ja'far ibn Muhammad al-Sadiq. You're following Quran. You're following the Prophet. You're following Allah. Don't idolize these individuals. They're just messengers that take you to the Ahlul Bayt. Nothing more. So you should switch overnight if that's proven to you. That's the challenge. I think one of the challenges in our taqlid system today is that people have developed identities around their maraja. And then you see people spending endless resources, publishing thousands of dollars or millions of dollars of posters and images, and to a healthy level it's fine. Because remember, these maraja are source of guidance, and when you strengthen that position, you strengthen overall society. But when it becomes unhealthy and competition and who can get the bigger portrait, on the Arba'in walk from Najaf and Karbala, and millions of dollars being wasted like that, we have a problem. I'll be very honest, we have a problem here. The followers are creating this problem. Don't idolize the marja. Respect them. They are your sources of guidance. They are the experts. So one indication is, if you were to switch that taqlid, if it's proven to you X person is more knowledgeable, do you have that unhealthy attachment? Then that tells you there's something wrong. The switch should be easy, because you accepted this marja as an expert. There's another better expert. You should immediately, without even having any hesitation, follow the better expert. And that will show you that your taqlid is healthy. But for some people, it's unhealthy.
But it is common consensus that as far as the scholar, this is not an issue perhaps amongst the marajas. It's
the followers. Exactly. Like I said, it's the followers who create this. In fact, the maraja themselves, the vast majority of them, I've seen them. I myself have witnessed. Sometimes the followers do these acts and activities, and they use resources in a way to make the image of their marja bigger, right? And to do more advertising. I've seen the marja with pain. Salaamu Alaikum. With pain, he condemns that. And he tells even the people in his office who are connected, he's like, I swear by Allah, I'm unhappy with this. Tell them, I don't accept this. This is unacceptable. Do something about it. But even the Prophet and the Imams, people gave them a hard time. Did all the Sahaba of the Prophet listen to the Prophet? What does Quran say? Tell me. Do you have a better leader than the Prophet? Did all the Sahaba listen to the Prophet? Did some of the Sahaba give a bad image of the Prophet? Yes. Sometimes the Prophet would dispatch some of these companions to do something. They'd end up killing other people. We mentioned some of them in the biography class. The Prophet would be upset. He would tell them, why? Why'd you do this? Or sometimes they come up with their own decisions, or even the Prophet and the Imams, not all their followers, followed them. Don't expect the maraja people to, seamlessly just follow them and accept every instruction that they... No, a lot of people, I've seen them challenging the maraja. When they feel passionate about something, I've seen them even challenging their marja, because they've now developed an identity around it. وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وآله الطاهرين. I'll say